Oh, bring us some figgy pudding. Yes, the classic Christmas song that sounds so 18th century. Don't we all want some figgy pudding? In fact, don't we want to know what a figgy pudding is? So many people ask about 18th century recipes and this classic Christmas recipe of a figgy pudding. Now, what is a figgy pudding? It is such a deep and interesting topic. I had to do some kind of deep dives, some rabbit holes here and there to figure out what was going on there. This song that's called We Wish You Were Merry Christmas is actually not a very, very old song. It doesn't even go back to the 18th century. And this part of the song, which is the part that we remember, oh, bring us some figgy pudding, isn't even really part of the older part of the song. Now, figs and 18th century cooking, you know what? Figs don't really show up in a lot of 18th century cookbooks. What this is really referring to is the classic English Christmas dish of a boiled plum pudding. That's what they are really talking about here in this recipe. So it's also funny that they call it a plum pudding, but it doesn't have plums in it. Well, it's called a figgy pudding and it doesn't have figs in it either, because this figgy pudding term is actually from the west part of England, places like Cornwall and Devonshire. They use this term, figgy, to mean a sweet raisin pudding. So in the 18th century, it was called a plum pudding, and they were talking about raisins. Later on, this fig term comes up. Again, it's just referencing raisins again. Now, we do have some classic, very, very old fig recipes in English cookery. If we go back to the Forme Curie, which is a combination of a 14th and a 15th century English cookery cookbooks that were brought out and published in the 18th century. They were interested about the history of cooking too. They are using figs in their recipes. They're getting boiled into compotes and combinations, pottages. There is an 18th century Christmas pottage that uses sometimes figs in it, which again is very similar to that very, very early recipe where we take raisins and meat broth and we boil them all together into a strange sweet stew. I want you to be able to do a figgy pudding, so we're going to be doing an 18th century figgy pudding or a plum pudding, and it's not going to be boiled. We're going to bake it because, again, I want anybody to be able to do this. We're even going to experiment with the ingredients a little bit to make it much easier to make with today's ingredients. So this recipe comes out of The Universal Cook by John Townsend. He isn't related to me, but he's got my name, so I'm good with this. This is a really good cookbook. It's published in 1773, and this particular recipe is not easy to find in other cookbooks. So I was really intrigued by it showing up here. And it's not published a lot in the 18th century. So many other of the cookbooks were published 20, 40, 50 times. This one only shows up just a little bit here in 1773. Here's the recipe: a plum pudding. Mix a quart of milk with a pound of beef suet cut small. Season it with nutmeg, rose water, and sugar. Then grate the crumb of 2 rolls, beat 7 eggs, and put in half a pound of currants, half a pound of raisins stoned. Mingle all these together well, butter the dish, bake it not too much. Grate sugar over it when it comes out of the oven. So this is a baked pudding, but it's almost exactly what a boiled pudding would be in the 18th century. We do have challenges, and one of those is suet. It starts off with suet right away, and I've got some real live, just right from the butcher's suet. This is not easy to find in a modern grocery store. You can get suet that's jarred up. This is something that we have on our website, so you can use this kind of suet, or they call it tallow here. This kind of raw, unprocessed suet is better if you can find it nice and fresh. I'm just very fortunate to have a butcher that I can just go and get suet from. So today we're going to be trying out this recipe with very cold butter that's chopped up. It is not going to give us exactly the same kind of texture, but we're going to get close. I'm always confused about these recipes because I would never put them together the way they're written. This one starts off with mixing the milk with the suet and then seasoning it with nutmeg and sugar and then putting in the breadcrumbs and then the eggs. Okay, none of that makes any sense. So we're going to rearrange this, put our dry ingredients together, put our wet ingredients together, and then put them all together at once. We're gonna start off here with about a half a pound of beef suet, or in this case, our substitute, which is our butter, and we wanna chop that up small. Make sure that your butter is very cold so that you can chop it up small or grate it small. So you can put it in the freezer if you want. That'll make it a lot easier. This is a Christmas time dish, so you should make it in a cold kitchen. We are going to half this recipe. We don't need a giant pudding. No one needs one this big. So we're gonna cut it down by half. You could even probably cut it down smaller than that at home. Let's put the wet ingredients together first. We have a pint of milk and it calls for 7 eggs. We can use 3 modern eggs. Let's whisk the eggs together and then add our pint of milk. And then we have our wet ingredients. I'm going to set that aside and let's do all the dry ingredients. Our dry ingredients, let's do the major part here. We're going to use regular breadcrumbs. They call for crumbing the loaf yourself. It is so much easier today to just go to the store and buy breadcrumbs. They'll turn out great. So get some regular unseasoned breadcrumbs, and I've got about a whole package here. I'm just gonna pour those in the bowl, and we're going to add our seasoning. So grate some nutmeg over the top of that. You definitely need some nutmeg in this. It is not a holiday dish if it doesn't have nutmeg in it. Then we're gonna put in our raisins. They call for stoned raisins. All our raisins today are without stones. Can you imagine going through every one of your raisins at home, cutting it open and getting all the seeds out? Thank goodness we live in the world where all our raisins are seedless. So we're gonna take 1/4 pound of raisins. They also call for currants. And the currants in this particular recipe mean the little tiny raisins. So you can have currants, you don't need them. Just regular raisins are good. If you wanna really mix it up, go ahead and have some currants too. Then about 1/4 pound of sugar into that. Some people might want a little more than that, but if you really want this sweetened properly, you probably want to make a sauce to go over the top of this when you serve it, rather than have a whole bunch of sugar inside of it. I'm gonna mix our breadcrumbs, our raisins, and our sugar all together with our spices and get that kind of all mixed together, and then we can put in our liquid ingredients. This is gonna make a very thick batter. If you find your mixture too thick or too thin, you can add a little bit more milk or a little bit more breadcrumbs to get to this thick batter consistency. And then we're gonna put it into the proper bowl here. I've got about a quart size bowl that we have pre-buttered, just like the recipe calls for. Make sure you butter that. And then we are going to bake this. This will bake in a very moderate oven, 350 degrees. I had to bake mine quite a while until they really got warm in the center, even though this recipe calls for not baking them too much. So if this was a boiled pudding, we would boil it at least 2 hours, maybe even 4 if it was a bigger pudding. This is probably gonna bake for 45 minutes to an hour and a half, depending on how cooked you want it to get into the center and how big your pudding is. This term figgy pudding, I did a little deeper research on it, and it turns out that the first time that we see this term figgy pudding, it being used and talking about raisin puddings or plum puddings in the 18th century, turns out to be 1810. And there's a magazine that has a dictionary of Devon and Cornwall vocabularies. Imagine if there was a magazine that we had today and it had an article all about, let's say, strange words that they used in Vermont or in Oregon. Same kind of deal. So this little dictionary has figs and figgy, and it says, oh, figgy, that's used as in figgy pudding, which means a raisin pudding or a plum pudding. So we have that there in 1810. I don't see it really talked about in literature much before that, but it's very likely that this term is a very 18th century kind of term. It just doesn't really get talked about or written about until 1810. If we look at the classic English cookbook of the 18th century, Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery, we find just 2 recipes that specifically mention Christmas. They're similar to each other in some ways, and they're both gigantic recipes. The first one is for a Christmas pie. And this Christmas pie isn't like in a pie dish that you're thinking of. You make a coffin, is what they would call it in the 18th century. You make this standing crust, very, very thick. It's ginormous. And inside of that, you put a chicken and a turkey and all these birds, like half a dozen birds, and you put the smaller ones inside the bigger ones. So you're making this giant meat pie. And then you cook it in a very hot oven for 4 hours. This is meant to serve a lot of people. And then the other recipe is for this plum porridge, specifically a Christmas plum porridge. We start off with a leg and a shin of beef, and we boil it in 8 gallons of water. And we take this broth, and in it we put things like 5 pounds of currants and 5 pounds of raisins, and maybe we put figs in there. And these get boiled with lots of spices and turned into this thick, gloopy porridge material. I don't know how this says Christmas to you. It's sort of a sweet meat something. Anyway, both of these are classic English Christmas recipes, and I really can't even imagine either one of these. Our pudding is out of the oven, and I did 2 puddings. I did one that was suet and one that was butter, and I think the butter one actually turned out better. The butter melts, it creates the holes, and I really baked these. I baked these longer than I expected, trying to get this suet to really kind of do its thing, and it just didn't. So I really recommend trying the butter version. Make sure that butter is nice and cold. It'll melt, it creates these voids, it butters the dish automatically, and now we can find out how this particular one tastes. So I've got a little bit here. I put some pudding sauce on this. So you just take equal amounts of a little bit of sugar, a little bit of wine, and a little bit of butter. Mix those together, heat them up, and you make this just amazing pudding sauce. You can use something like maple syrup if you really want to. But let's find out how it turned out. This is tremendous. So one of the things that's happening with these puddings is that they're very dense. They're supposed to be dense. The boiled ones are very dense, and these baked ones turn out almost exactly the same way, which is good. Very sweet, packed with flavor, just packed with flavor. Especially if you have a pudding sauce, you can play with those flavors. You can get some just tremendous things. Very, very 18th century, very traditional, very Christmas. I hope you enjoy this figgy pudding.